now we have our workshop, and workshop is it's with Trend Community, and which is cooperating with Horizon. And they were going to show to us what is a flare. And just to note that we're going to have first a workshop which is going to last 45 minutes, and after that, we're going to have our food, our meal, okay? So thank you very much, and may I introduce Chiara?
Maria.
Maria, sorry, Maria.
Okay.
I forgot, sorry,
Compliments
guys,
to
but
be
I
mistaken
have
for-
seen too many people the same
Exactly.
day, and who is going to introduce and to tell you some more things about the workshop. Thank you again.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Maria Picconi. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a digital health analytics company called Trend Community. Over the last couple of days, we've heard time and time again 3 key themes. First, I think everybody's in agreement that we need to always incorporate the patient voice at every stage of clinical care, research, and drug development. Second, that while that's the goal, there's also a burden and often burnout that community members can experience because there are often, a certain number of people that consistently raise their hand to be part of this process. And then third is really the need to create a shared lexicon to describe subjective symptoms like fatigue, pain, and neurological issues. So today we're going to talk about flares, and we're going to explore the language that patients use to describe their flares, and then how this aligns, or more often misaligns, with the clinical definition. Again, I wanted to thank our friends at Horizon Therapeutics, now Amgen, for providing financial support for this research. And I'm joined today by my husband, Christopher DeFelice, who's also co-founder of Trend and our Chief Technology Officer, and also Dr. Baldini and Coralie, who certainly don't need an introduction to this crowd. So I want to quickly just poll the audience. So can you raise your hand if you're a person either living with Sjögren's or a care partner to someone living with Sjögren's? Great, thank you. And how about clinicians, if you're a clinician? Oh, okay. I see a little hand over there. Researchers? And then our industry partners. Maybe the biggest crowd, industry partners. Okay, good. They're here to listen. Oh, there we go. All right. So the other part of our story is that our journey, Chris and I are also parents to a child with a rare genetic disorder called Prader-Willi syndrome. And our experience managing a rare disease was the inspiration for Trend Community. And after joining a community on Facebook of caregivers of kids living with Prader-Willi syndrome, we realized that there was a big gap between what we'd read about the disease in the medical literature and what was actually happening within our patient community. And so we saw an opportunity to use AI to analyze the conversations that we were having within those support groups, sharing our experiences, sharing our stories, and turn that into real-world data. And the way that we do that is it's very interactive and it's very bidirectional. So it's called social listening. Social listening is that the act of taking conversations from social media. You all know we talk about everything and anything online, using technology, AI, to understand, to turn those conversations into concepts, into trends. But then, in order to make sense of the data that we receive from those conversations, we need people, we need stakeholders within the community to then turn the data into real world evidence. And so we've created this bi-directional, this sort of infinity loop where we take the data and we come together in meetings like this, and we think about what are the unmet needs of the community and where are the opportunities to use these rich insights from social media to fill in some of those gaps in the medical and scientific literature. All right, so for this particular talk, the idea was born out of a workshop that we held, a similar workshop that we held at ULAR earlier this year, where we presented sort of the early insights that we were gleaning from the Sjögren's community. Dr. Baldini attended that workshop, and she noticed that flares was a trending concept in our data. And so she approached us and asked if we could dive deeper into the lexicon around flares. And now I want to hand it over to Dr. Baldini to explain why, from her perspective, this was such an important thing to do.
So, okay, it's working. Well, it was exciting actually at the ULAR last year to hear about the definition of flares that was described by analyzing communication between patients. And what I asked Maria was, what about trying to create a common language? Because the impression, we want to work together. This is the real message that we share today. But to work together, I think that the first step is to use a common language, a common meaning to the words. And probably some of our problems in Sjögren, some of the unmet needs derives from the discrepancies between medical definition and the community definition of flares, symptoms, and several tools. So this is the challenge that we have, that we face, and this is where the story of this workshop starts.
Thank you. And then as we were sort of digging into literature, trying to understand the background, if something like this had been done before, we actually came upon a poster that Coralie and her team had done previously at ULAR. So Coralie, if you could just speak also to what inspired you to start that research.
Yeah, it's again within the Necessity Project, where we are 7 patients, 7 in the patient advisory group. And we started to work on next step of, you've heard of STAR many times, I won't go back on STAR again. And within the Necessity Project, there's another thing which is called STAFF, which is a new score to assess flares. And during the debates, as you know, we are including in a lot of workshops, and during the debate within the work package, we realized that we were not speaking the same language with the clinicians, we as patients. And we decided with my colleagues to start to work on a definition of flares. So obviously it's a preliminary work because we as patients, we can't do this alone, and it's a collaborative work, as Professor Banley said. But we started to work on a definition, and we tried to explore what was the meaning of a flare for patients. So yeah, we wrote an abstract which has been selected in ULAR this year with a strange title, because it was flare. Did you say flare? So that's how it started, and but I think we'll speak again later.
Thank you. So Dr. Baldini had a nice idea, though we don't all have paper and pen here, but maybe just think about for a minute, what is your definition of a flare? And then, this workshop is intended to be interactive. So as we go through the data and we have this discussion, let's see if your perception of a flare sort of changes over the course of this workshop. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it over to Chris, and he's going to start to walk through, explain how we do our data analytics, and start to talk about the data that we've been analyzing over the last couple of years.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you also, Coralie, Dr. Baldini, for working on this project with us. Thank you to the conference for allowing us to present this work. I get excited because, obviously we work on data. This was a really fun project because it's fun when somebody else brings the question to us and my data science team, and we get to dig into something that we don't quite, we don't necessarily understand, right? My data scientists don't understand Sjögren, so it was nice to come in with a question and get some enlightenment from our colleagues. So the big question is, what's a flare? Now, we specialize in social media conversations. So we kind of broke this into three parts. How much does the community talk about flares? What are flares, which is the big one? What are flares to the community? And what are mental and emotional impacts of flares? So that's kind of how we broke it down. We move on to the next slide. These are some strengths and limitations with our approach. So with any good research, you want to identify the strengths, identify some of those limitations. The biggest one is the empowerment to the community. I think there's been a lot about patient voice, and this really does rise and brings that out and amplifies that. It helps with a lot of other stakeholders, but I believe for the community in itself, this is very impactful. And there are some limitations as you see here as well. Just for time, I'm going to move on. So with our data source, we decided to look at Reddit. Reddit is a social media platform that allows people to create themed areas called subreddits. And many of those themed areas are disease specific. In this case, there's a Sjögren's subreddit, as you see here. And going to one of those strengths, we see the volume of data. So we're able, from this one specific area in social media, analyze over 59,000 posts and comments, right? Spans about 11 years, and we have over 5,000 different authors contributing to this subreddit. Now, when I say authors, I'm not saying these are people that are necessarily, I tell you that they're diagnosed with Sjögren's, right? But we assume that they have some type of connection for the reason that they're traveling to here and willing to engage in here. But so we have over 5,000 different perspectives, or somebody sharing some thought. And with our technology, we are able to analyze or pick up on certain areas. So as you see here, this kind of spreads globally from the location. So a lot of times people in social media will share where they're situated or located. Hey, I'm over here in this part of the world, and they're talking maybe about how there are limitations in their healthcare system and trying to get information about the condition. And then we saw here a lot with the prevalence for the females being more highly diagnosed. We see that as well, and we do see 11% of the people disclose gender in these conversations, and we can detect that. As you see here, it's only a third. It's more skewed towards the females, but we do have a decent amount of males that are sharing some type of perspective on Sjögren. So, which was interesting, being that it's not highly prevalent with males, but this is a space where males are coming in some capacity, whether it's talking about their partner or maybe they're talking about themselves. So moving on to the next, we want to understand how the community talks about flares. Now, the next slide here, this is just, so everyone always says artificial intelligence, right? We use artificial intelligence. We use it's very broad and hard to understand. So I want to just take this slide to kind of demystify our approach to it. We use a form of artificial intelligence called natural language processing, right? Essentially what we're trying to do is teach machines, computers, to break down human language, right? So we can understand it and process it and do cool projects like this. So one of those mechanisms that we do here, and I'll walk through here, is something we call like clinical entity extraction, clinical entity linking. So working from the left to the right, we could take an input statement, right? That input statement could be a social media statement, a post, a comment, and we can analyze that statement, right? And what this approach, right? we can then look for entities. Now, entities are words in the text, right? Words in the input statement that we're looking for. In this case, it's highlighting arthralgia, right? And then what the entity recognition is trying to do is going to label that. We want to give it a label. In this case, it's labeling it as a symptom, right? So one of the things that we label with is symptom. The power of the entity, this clinical entity recognition model that we have, is that it could do more than just label symptoms, right? It could label diseases. It could label drugs, right? So we can identify different types of drugs that people are talking about. It can label emotions, right? We can understand what kind of emotions people are sharing in here. And then the next piece is that linking concept, right? So after we are able to identify an entity or entities, right? So they don't have to just a single word. It could be multiple words, as you see in joint pain being highlighted here. We want to link that to something, right? And we have something called a lexical knowledge base. That's internal. And why that's important is that it allows us to be consistent with our research and allows us to be reproducible with our research. It also allows us to maybe find areas where maybe we're having degradations with some of our approaches. And this is built on common terminologies that I think many of you in this room are familiar with, right? These different medical terminologies, ontologies. So it's built on top of that we're linking to. So just a little bit aspect of how this piece is, this kind of works so it's not so confusing. So what goes into the next slide, which is our first kind of getting into the data here. So what we did was, right, so we're able to highlight symptoms, right, identify entities and label them as symptoms. And what we wanted to see was, well, one, you can look at data and kind of, a lot of times you can look at data and twist the numbers to see how you want, but we just want to see, are people talking about flares enough in this data source to use this data source for this workshop, right, as this example that we're trying to do here. And as we see here, we see that they're talking about flare-ups alongside some of the other common hallmark symptoms you would see in the literature for Sjögren's. Now, that's not really surprising to me, being that a lot of times you would expect that people are going to be talking about a symptom and a flare-up, right? I'm having a flare with a symptom. So it's not as shocking to see that they're talking about flare-ups and symptoms. What the interesting piece here, at least for me, was that our system tagged flares. So flares makes up of flares, flaring, flare. Our system tagged flares as a symptom, right? So that's how it got on here. It didn't just come up we didn't force it on here to say, okay, well, we found the mentions of flares and we applied it against symptoms. No, it came up on the symptom chart, right? Because we did a whole bunch of different analyses, but we chose to share this one because they're talking, so to me, I was like, okay, well, when the entity extraction labeled flares, we had a hard time linking, right? It kept giving us these, wasn't linking it to our lexical knowledge base. Remember, our lexical knowledge base is built on other existing medical terminology and ontologies. And we're like, well, why are we having a hard time linking this, right? It's coming up as finding. Sometimes it's not coming up at all. And that's because flares is very inconsistently actually in these terminologies or in these ontologies, right? Sometimes you'll see it in a few of them as a finding. And other times you'll see it has to be paired with a symptom. So the concept of flare is symptom as a flare, right? So this was really impactful. It was profound for us and interesting. I got excited because I was, looking forward to sharing this with Dr. Bordini and Coralie. And I'm gonna, and so that was intriguing. And I'm gonna stop there to share our thoughts with the rest of my colleagues here.
So Coralie, would love to hear your reaction to that finding.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all because as patients, when we talk to each other, and if we don't feel okay, if we feel bad, we won't say, oh, today I've got headache, joint pain, blah, 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 blah. We say, I think I'm in a flare. So we, as patients, are talking about flare as a bunch of symptoms. And that was exactly what we developed in our abstract. A bunch of symptoms which are worsening for a limited time. Because it's our interpretation of a flare. We want detail. And something, Christopher, you said very interesting about drug within your analysis. I really think that drug is important in your analysis for patients because sometimes patients won't say specific symptoms, but they will say to another patient, oh, yeah, I'm all right, but I started again with any drug. And the patient in front will understand directly why the patient took that specific drug. So again, discrepancy between what you can find on social media about the patient talks and the real life patient talks. So yeah, I'm not surprised at all by your graphics and your figures.
Thanks, Coralie. So again, there are so many different ways that we can explore the data. So please kind of make a mental note of the things that might be of interest to you. We could explore co-occurrences of drugs with mentions of flares, for example. All right, next.
Okay, yeah, so next we want to look at, so what are flares to the community? So we have identified that they're talking about flares, right, in this data set. So let's look into how they're talking about that. So this next piece was, we did this analysis actually because when we started this project, Dr. Bodini was talking about how from the clinical aspect, it's very, they try to identify it more as a procedure or some type of measurement. And then she was saying it's not like that for the community. So we did this breakdown in terms of now that we can identify these statements that are talking about flares, right? We can kind of segment the data into, okay, here are the non-flare conversations, and here are the flare conversations, right? So the biggest takeaway from this, if you're looking at it, right, and you don't really want to dissect, is that like symptoms are talked about more significantly in the post and flare comments than they are if they're talking about test type comments or body parts. So once again, body part symptoms and tests are one of those things that we can identify through that CER, that clinical entity recognition, that clinical entity linking process here, right? So we identified those documents, we broke them up into non-flare and flare, and as you see here, basically is that when they're talking about flares, they're talking about symptoms, right? That's what it looks like from here. And then just to look into this a bit further, into the next slide, we did something called, so basically on the y-axis is just frequency, right? So what we're plotting here are other concepts now being discussed in the data set. And on the y-axis, just frequency. How often does that occur with flares, right? So symptoms are occurring over 700 times when they talk about flares in these documents. So frequency is great. That tells you one thing, right? Okay, this occurs a lot. But we do know that in just language in of itself, that certain words just co-occur a lot more with others. So how do we account by that for the just fact that these just could be occurring by chance because they occur so much? And that's where the x-axis comes into. The x-axis is something called a PMI score. Basically, the farther to the right the plot, the more highly associated the plotted point is with flares, okay? Right? So if it's further to the right, the stronger the association, right? The higher up on the graph, the more frequently it occurs, right? So PMI squared kind of it's a nice measure to kind of account for frequency, but also, but really drawn to association. So what you're seeing here, just to give you an example, is basically what we saw from the previous slide, is most of this, the ones we plotted are really associated with symptoms and body parts, kind of like what we were seeing on the previous slide. What we're not seeing here, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm not saying this doesn't exist. It's just not the highest, it's not occurring the most or highly associated, are things around testing, especially testing with flares. Like, I took some test and I'm in a state of flare, or I'm having a state of flare, a flare-up is happening. So we found this interesting, just to kind of go into that a bit further.
One second, sorry, Chris. I just want to say there should be dots on here. We'll share these slides out, but you can.
Well, I didn't even know that.
You can from the words too.
There's dots on my slide.
Like
Sorry. Yeah, so it's plotting a bunch of points. Yeah, that's unfortunate. So basically, what we're seeing were a lot of things around like.
No, I can see the words. It's okay.
Oh, we go to the next one. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So taking symptoms, so going back to the symptoms associated with flares, we're taking this PMI score again. Unfortunately, you don't have as much context as I was hoping you'd have on this, but once again, so the x-axis is association, right? So we're looking at association, what symptoms are strongly associated with flares here. And, actually sitting in on some of the talks this last 2 days, I had other points of interest here, but the one I actually do want to point out is the fact that you see fatigue, I would actually ignore symptoms and pain, because symptoms and pain is so common, because it's such a general term that people use. People always talk about pain in a very general term. And we can dissect pain and go into types of pain even more. And the same thing with symptoms, obviously, as we see varying symptoms being displayed here. But if you ignore those first two, the interesting piece here, and I'd say for me, is that, especially from my learnings the last 2 days being here, is fatigue is the most associated symptom with flares in here, more than you'll seeing like the dryness of eye. Now, like taking from someone who's coming from the outside in, and I'm doing my literature review, my data scientists were doing our literature reviews to understand Sjögren's a bit, right? We're reading about the xerostomia. We're reading about all the dryness, the dryness symptoms in Sjögren's, right? We don't read about fatigue. We're not reading about fatigue. Now, I'm not trying to say it's not there. I'm just trying to say our approach from this research project. So, but then sitting in here, how fatigue is so important and such an important unmet need to the community. Now, this is, once again, this is taking into account how frequently fatigue is occurring, but also the strong association, right, to fatigue with when people are talking about flares, at least in the social media ecosphere.
Okay, so now over to you, Dr. Baldini. Is this, how does this align with what you're hearing from patients in your clinic?
Thank you, Maria. Of course, these reflect the common reality. The point here is that if we want to use the definition of flares and symptoms as an endpoint in clinical trials, the problem is to define properly what is a flare, because otherwise, when you use PROs as an endpoint in clinical trials, a drug may fail in reaching the primary endpoint if we do not agree in what we are measuring. What I mean is that from the medical perspective, often we are more related to tests in measuring, for example, this one. I want to comment on that slide first, because when we analyze a biological drug and how it impacts on the definition of inflammation based on blood tests, let's say, for example, hypergammaglobulinemia as a marker of B-cell hyperactivity, or low complements value, or the total number of white blood cells, or the abnormalities in the urine tests. Tests are here. There is a different perspective. The green column is lower than the dark column in this slide, where is always higher or equal in the other domains. So we are really talking a different language, and we need to align, because otherwise, in this particular moment where we have a lot of novel drugs, the risk is not to catch the real effectiveness of the drug, because the topic is that there is a difference in living with Sjögren and then the illness, perceiving the burden of the illness influenced by all the daily life, and really focusing on what the drugs is doing. So this is a real challenge where we have to work together.
All right, next topic.
All right, so now we'll look into a little bit of the emotional and mental impacts of flares. This is just kind of like a skin the surface, just because we're trying to keep time moving on. So there's more there's so much to unpack around the mental health and emotional aspects of looking at any condition. And I'm sure I don't really need to tell most of the people in this room about how we can unpack this and spend a whole 45 minutes, an hour and a half on it. But what we have at our disposal with at least our analytics, our artificial intelligence, we can look at mental health conversations or try to identify the posts and comments that have some type of mental health pattern-like to it. Now, we're not saying these are people that have a mental health diagnosis or are in some mental health state, but it's around the structure or patterns of the language that might be someone sharing something about what's making them feel anxious, what's making them stressed, maybe depressed or down. So this model can take in one of those statements that we talked about, right, one of those posts or comments, and it could basically give us a, you know, with high confidence, like a likelihood of whether or not it's related to a mental health like structure or not. So what we see here, once again, we can identify the non-flare and flare conversations. We looked at those two buckets, and then we ran this model through those statements for each of these buckets and then gave a breakdown on which one the model said is talking about mental health or could possibly talk about mental health and which aren't. And basically what you see here is that when they're talking about flares or the flares being detected in the conversation, that there's almost a 12%, 11% difference, higher probability that there'll be some type of mental health type language happening in there as opposed to the non-flare conversations. So maybe no surprise, but once again, when you're doing this type of stuff, it's nice to have some type of evidence or, you know, something to back that up. And then moving on to the next piece, focusing on the flare stuff, we like to do something called topic analysis, right? So topic analysis it's a great approach because, I mean, once again, like our engine doesn't know anything, right? Our approach, our analytics doesn't know anything about Sjögren's. Right? We're not teaching it, you know, this is what you're looking for Sjögren's or any disease in general, right? So, and these type of algorithms just look at the data and basically it's just bucketing the data, right? So what it does is it looks at all the statements and it starts bucketing them into separate areas of similarities, right? Is this post similar to that post? Is this similar to that post? And it creates these buckets, right? Now, if people have been watching the news a lot, there's another aspect called generative AI, which has become very popular lately. So we have a small component of generative AI in our system. So what we do is after we create these buckets of topics, we'll take each of those buckets, we'll feed it to this generative AI component of our system, and that will look at those topics and it'll create a label. And what you see, this is actually rendering, right? Okay. What you see are those labels being generated by the topics that were bucketed in here. And what you see is the largest special dietary requirements is the larger topic. These are just the flare conversations that we did the topic analysis on. But on the next slide, I'm going to focus on the second largest topic. I actually don't want to focus on the special dietary requirements since this is a section about like mental health and emotions and stuff. I actually want to focus on the second topic because this one, when I saw it, once again, I got super excited when my team proposed it to me, and I was, you know, I couldn't wait to pull Coralie and Dr. Baldini on the call because I was excited about it. So I was looking forward to getting seeing their reaction when we showed it to it. But the second biggest topic was something called, and once again, this is the AI generating the topic. It's called flipping the switch. And what's fascinating, these are quotes taken from some of those statements from the bucket there. This is on Reddit. This is a public data source. So one reason why we're sharing the quotes, we do a lot of private data sources, in which case we wouldn't share a direct quote like this from a private group, but this is a publicly accessible data source on Reddit. So these are direct quotes coming from those statements. There's so many fascinating things in here, but one of the things that I actually was approaching my data scientists about when we're like going about like, how do they define flares? I'm like, I guarantee you somebody in this group is defining it in some way, right? How we go about finding that, I don't know, but they found it through our process. They found it, and that second one illustrates the second quote and the first sentence is that wave of symptoms you're experiencing are called flares, and it just was, you know, fascinating to me. The other fascinating piece, I want to stop and I want to give time for Coralie and Dr. Baldini to actually talk about this, and you probably want to hear their perspective more on it than mine. But it goes back to the first slide with the symptoms, right? And how our system tagged flares as a symptom, but then we couldn't link it because flares doesn't come up as a symptom in a lot of the technologies. And you look at some of this, a lot of these quotes are them just talking about flares with no mention of a symptom. Right? You see a mention of a body part and maybe the third one, but the second sentence of that second quote is just, I'm flaring my butt off. But they're just talking about flaring, right? Just flaring as a symptom. It's just, as someone that uses technology to understand language, it's just fascinating to me to see this, and then, you know, being able to participate on this project and hearing, their struggles and the misalignment that they're talking about, I thought this was very profound for me and my team. So I think there's just really, I think kind of sheds a light on what we're getting at here. So then moving on.
Yeah. So first of all, let's hand it over to Coralie. I'll just keep this up here. Coralie had a pretty strong reaction to this slide as well when we first presented it to her.
Yeah, when I saw this and when I saw the quotes you choose, I had just one thing to say, that is the story of Sjögren patient's life. We go and visit our doctors. Every biologic results are normal, we feel awful. That story of unmet needs. So no, I'm not surprised at all again. One comment, in your analysis, there were no mention of tests, doctor's visits, and so on. Not at all. So we don't know and we can't know if following that discussions of flare, the patient went to see a clinician, a doctor. That was just one comment. And another one comment, very important, on mental health conversation that you show. 32% of patients in a non-flare were around 32% of discussions. And when they think that they got a flare, there will be 43. And that's another really important point, because again, patients are associating flares with symptoms. And worsening, that was our definition, symptoms become significantly worse. And if the symptoms get worse, the patient gets worse, and the mental health gets worse as well. So that was just a couple of comments.
So, Coralie, thank you for the question about whether or not people are at some point talking about experiencing a flare and then subsequently going to their doctors or getting tests. This is an example of something that we could explore further. While there didn't seem to be a lot of conversation around tests, there was some data. So we don't always need to look at the sort of most trending topics. We can also drill down into those conversations where maybe we have less data, but there might be something really meaningful embedded in that data.
Can I share something really quick, Maria?
Yep.
Yeah, so to your point too about the test, we don't, actually in social media you can't know where they follow up. But the other interesting piece about these quotes when they came out was that, they were referencing tests though in here, right? So they're referencing like the blood work, but how, even it doesn't matter if their bloods come back, right? To them, it's more of this kind of internal esoteric state that they're maybe getting at, where I'm identifying my flare internally and I don't need a test. And maybe that's one reason, maybe they're not going to get a follow-up, because even if your test says I'm negative, like I'm not in a state of flare. And once again, this is the interpretation of myself and our team that's coming in from the outside in, and the experience from at least the question and the misalignment that the two of you were saying, hey, can we look at this, was coming into. So yeah, they are talking about tests, they're just not talking about it a lot in this forum, right? So it's there, it's just not as much. And once again, why is that? I'm sure there's plenty of different things we can explore into, but it's just interesting to see that they're identifying that, like, yes, my bloods might look fine, but I'm in a state of there's crisis going on here, right? So so it's there, but not as much. And why is that?
All right, so now we're going to open it up for questions. And Katie, you can keep me on task and let us know when we're running out of time. But any questions? We are working on a manuscript on this. Again, the data here just kind of scratched the surface. We really wanted to, share with you all the work that we're doing. If anyone's interested in joining us and participating in this research, we welcome anyone and everyone. But any questions, curiosities, or is it validating? Do we have, oh, there we go.
It's a question about temporality. How much time for a flare? What time do you consider a flare is lasting? Because it could be a simple worsening on a ascending curve and not really. It's the definition of flare. A flare, is it like that? You recover or not? I think it's very important at the beginning to analyze.
Dr. Baldini, do you have?
Yeah, I think that you have just raised a very important part of the definition of flare, because there are so many different kinds of flares. The grumbling disease, always there, the relapsing remitting, that is somehow typical in rheumatological conditions, or these ups and then relief. So going deeper, what I want to share with you is that working with the research in Sjögren and looking at data coming from the observational studies that we have been performing in all the centers devoted to Sjögren, it is so impressive how just listening to the conversation, to informal conversation and messages, some true aspects of the disease come out. So I think that what is new here is the possibility of using new sources of information to improve our way of approaching the disease, because it's an immediate snapshot. Of course, we going deeper with the right questions, like your question, the relationship between flares and medical doctors, drugs and flares, the kind of flares are all going deeper, starting from the data coming from a different source. It's not a questionnaire. It's not asking a patient to fill a questionnaire and ask him to tell us about the symptoms. It's just talking about the disease informally that allows to really see in the slides that pain, fatigue are more common than dryness, for example, or more common than extraglandular manifestation.
And one of the things we can do on Reddit, because it is a public data source, is we can actually look at individual experiences over time. And so that might be an opportunity to kind of explore, individually as people talk about flares, like what's happening before, what's happening after. Can we find patterns in sort of when the flares are popping up in the conversations?
Yes, it's very useful if you can do it.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great suggestion.
Yeah, what I would like to add is something that to me is very important, that patients, when they talk about flares, they often talk about existing symptoms and not necessarily new symptoms, which again, it will be a discrepancy between the medical, the HCPs and us. We need to work on that flare definition. It's important to empower patients again and to help them with their disease management. It's going to be really helpful for patients to have that exact definition, to be able to recognize a new symptom or a worsening of their condition, and which can be a red flag for them, and to go to their clinician. But again, difference between existing symptoms worsening and new symptoms occurring. And I think it's really important to work on it as well.
Actually, I wanted to share I want to just comment on one of Dr. Baldini's comments about the listing aspect and the informal listing and just people talking about it. Because that highlights one of the strengths too that was on the strengths slide, is that this is just unprompted, it's unsolicited. People are coming to these spaces, and it doesn't have to be Reddit, it could be any online support space that could be Sjögren's or another condition, that they're going there and they're not being prompted, they're not being forced to go there or asked to go there. They're going there just to seek support or maybe to give support. And I think like that, and that's just kind of how Maria and I in our first experience came into this, right? We and realized that these conversations that are happening are just incredibly insightful and rich with just the day-to-day experiences that people are trying to just get through and conquer, or maybe just get by. So I thought that was a really great point that you brought up, Dr. Bodini, and highlights one of the strengths of this type of research or this approach,
Katie?
Yes, one question. Okay, we're talking about flares, existing or new ones, but what about persuading our physicians that we have a flare? Because in some cases, the physicians cannot accept our flares because they cannot see it. So this is the problem, okay, because this is very good, very exciting results, but the main problem is the communication between patients and doctors to understand us. Because as yesterday told that, okay, the doctor is happy, but we're not happy. And sometimes they do not believe us.
Well, and you only have a moment to be with your doctor. And we actually had a discussion about this last night, that when you go to your doctor and you feel heard and validated, in that moment you feel good, right? So maybe that sort of skews how you're actually doing, because you're feeling great in that moment because someone's listening to you. For our daughter's condition, Prader-Willi syndrome, we use social listening to connect that to another rare disease, narcolepsy. One of the first things we realized is that parents thought their kids were faking falling asleep. And through a process like this, we partnered with pediatric neurologists at Texas Children's who helped us to understand disordered sleep from a clinical perspective. And then we were able to train our engine to go back through those conversations and start to understand how and quantify how much people might be talking about the symptoms of narcolepsy and cataplexy. And then once we made that connection, we could use the data to inform the community that your kid's probably not faking it, has a name, and it's called narcolepsy. And then the parents could take those reports, those data, that's that infinity loop, right, back to their rheumatologist. So maybe as an output of this, we can start to describe the experience from social media of a flare over time and give the community members something that they can bring with them and leave with their rheumatologists, with their primary care physicians, that articulates that for them. I love that idea.
Okay, this is our next project, I think, Coralie.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're on it.
Well, and I think to add to that, to your point, right, our general theme too is about education. And you have a lot of, I think this is a great kind of, in terms of how do we get there, this is a great, you have a person from the community, we have a physician that specializes in up here trying to understand and recognize the disconnect, and then trying to, how can we use new ways like technology to uncover new ways to do research, coupled with the traditional ways to do that. But I think the other piece is just publishing, right? So a lot of doctors or physicians that might not be familiar with Sjögren's do read literature, a lot of it, right? That's how they get a lot of their information. And I know this is something that Dr. Bodini and Maria have already been collaborating on, but how do we do this type of stuff too and get that published, right? Because that's another form of education, educating a lot of the other medical professionals out there who are doing great jobs, right? But you just can't understand every single, all these different diseases that are out there. So.
And we've set up our process to allow for that. So we go under IRB review. All of our data analysts are HIPAA trained. We treat the conversations like medical data. So we're set up nicely to be able to publish.
Yeah, we both need clear definitions. And when we will have definitions, we can work on tools to evaluate flares for clinical trial and for daily management of patients. Because, again, the high variability of symptoms makes things difficult. If we do have clear definitions, we will speak the same language, patients and clinicians. So we need a definition. Patient association will communicate, disseminate, and empower patients about that kind of definitions. And we will have patients more educated and more able to communicate with a good language with their clinicians. And that will help, again, to reduce the discrepancy and will improve communication between patients and clinicians.
One more question, Linda.
Yeah, thanks for showing the data, and I'm of course intrigued by the connection between the flare and the mental health and the increase in the talk about that on the social media platforms. I was wondering if you've looked like more in depth in what people are saying, and I can imagine that it's not just an increase from 30 to 40 something %, but it's also like qualitatively different what they are talking about, because maybe if you have non-flare, and this is just from the top of my mind, you may feel like maybe like some symptoms of like maybe depression or be sad about being diagnosed. Whereas like if you have a flare, and especially if it's not recognized in your blood work and by the doctors, you may be like anxious about future progression, you maybe feel frustrated. So that could be qualitatively different between those two, not just quantitatively. So I was wondering if you will be able to look into that and explore that further.
Yeah, so absolutely. I don't have, so we did look at it in more depth. I just don't have, I was just looking to see if I had any appendix slides that are on it. So as you saw how we were able to look at, like, unfortunately that one slide where we looked at the different plot of the concepts in terms of frequency, it didn't render here, and that's unfortunate. But I think it gives you an idea, right? So we can look at those differences in terms of the non-mental health, the non-flare conversations and the ones that were tagged mental health, and compare and contrast that at a more granular level in terms of what are the difference, like what are those co-occurrences that are happening in there? What are those networks, right? A very common approach is like just having these different type of networks and looking at the strength between them. So to answer your question, that's something that absolutely can be done, and we can do that, like, and we started to. It just, we just didn't have the data here to show that.
Great. Well, you know where to find me, so that's
Yeah, and in closing, for anyone who doesn't know how to find us, if you would just take a moment, there's a really brief survey, and you can just throw us any ideas that you have about research questions that you'd like to explore. Certainly reach out. I just want to close with one other comment, is that in some of the work that we've been doing for a longer period of time, the example of narcolepsy in Prader-Willi syndrome, in gout, proactive versus reactive management of gout, we're actually able to use this now as a tool to see if all of these initiatives that we're doing that are inspired by this work are making a difference. And we can actually see, for example, in Prader-Willi syndrome, 5 years ago, we were saying our kids were faking falling asleep, describing microsleeps while eating. Now we have narcolepsy in our lexicon, and we can show that from the data. And in gout, with our community, one of the major goals was to try to shift the conversation towards proactively managing your gout through things like uric acid monitoring, and steer the conversations a bit away from the cherry juice and apple cider vinegar and things that may not have sort of a scientific foundation. And we recently did an analysis, and we could see that just in the last 3 months compared to the last year, the conversations around uric acid monitoring are going up, and the conversations around those other things are going down. And we've done some really cool work in that space as well, to look at the mental health association with positive versus mental health statements when patients are talking about proactively managing their condition versus when they're talking about reactively managing their condition. Anyway, thank you all. This was amazing. It's been an amazing couple of days, and I don't want to keep anyone any longer from eating. So thanks, Katie, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. And now let's say 2 words for closing officially our Congress. And let's have it with us. Massa, Coralie, and Joyce. Unfortunately, Anna is missing, so we would like to thank you, all of you that have participated in our Congress. We hope that you like it, You love it. You learn too many things, I think. We learned too many things. We had exciting presenters, exciting presentations, and now we're giving our next conference in 2 years. And last but not least, I would like to thank all our participants and also our sponsors. That means Janssen, Novartis, Horizon, and Bristol. Without them support, we will not be able to do the Congress. And thank you all for them, for us, and for us, and thank you for them. And last but not least, Nikki, can you please be here? Yeah. We would like to thank you, Nikki, who was the project leader of the organizing the conference. I know that she sent you a lot of emails, but she wants to be much more informative. She wants. Thank you, Nikki, for all you've done and for your work. Thank you. And so, we're not keeping you anymore from the lunch. Please be in mind that in a quarter to 4, we have to be in the reception to go for our sightseeing. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.